righty, we're here on another document inside of our template called the Limited Agency Agreement. Remember, this document it's super redundant if you've done all the other documents. You know, a buyer's exclusive agency agreement talks about limited agency being a possibility and gives permission. Office policy gives permission, right? Listing contract, I believe, gives permission. But if this situation arises, this is the form that we must fill out. This is when the licensee, meaning the agent, represents both buyer and seller or both landlord and tenant. The managing broker personally represents a client, and then a licensee represents the other client. So for instance, if Brent, who's the managing broker for Indiana Fathom, if Brent had a listing and I bring a buyer, it is a limited agency. The reason, because Brent is technically the agent for my buyer because of the way Indiana law works. I don't personally have true legal clients. Only Brent does. So my clients are Brent's clients. Why that is the way it is, I don't understand exactly. Why it's not limited agency. Anytime somebody in our office is working with somebody else in our office, because again, both of them are Brent's clients, but it's less about the client, it's more about representation. Brent and I are not going to talk about these clients, and we're going to keep everything secret, and that's the way it's going to go, okay? So, and they're separate, all their documents are separate. It's in my zip forms that he can't get to. His are in his zip forms I can't get to. I can't see his emails, those sorts of things, right? But when Eli Skinner, a licensee, represents the buyer and the seller, or when a managing broker and the affiliated licensee, like me, represents the other client, it's also limited agency. So, in this case, if it's a licensee that Eli Skinner represents both buyer and seller, then this is an easy form. You know, date, buyer, seller, property address, name of the limited agent. Who is representing both? In this case, it's Eli representing both buyer and seller. Okay, that's literally how this goes. If it's where Brent and me, then it's going to be Brent is the limited agent, not me. Because I do not have anything to do with his people, but he kind of has to do with mine. So I'm going to write Brent down as the limited agent on this one. Purchase price, listed price also mean... so actually, let me jump in. When it's our team, I will likely have you write the offer under your own self. Normally, everything goes under me, under my number. But when it's a team, we have two options. The safe option is we do a limited agency agreement, and I personally am the limited agent because I'm representing both people. The unsafe, but still probably okay way, as long as we do our part of not talking, is we don't do a limited agency, and you write the deal under you, and we don't talk. And I stay doing the deal with my listing or whatever. I'm doing it, and we don't talk, okay? I can live with that, but then the paperwork has to be done differently than a normal team paper. Normal team paper is everything's under Eli. Eli's the buyer's agent, or Eli's the listing agent, no matter who's got the client. But in this case, Eli would have the listing, and Andrea would have the buyer, and you would be listed as the buyer's agent because we're not in limited agency that way. However, I'm going to say that the safest way and the way we should generally handle it is name Eli down here as a limited agent and go ahead and write all the paperwork under me. That's the safe way, and that's what I'm going to encourage everybody to go. So, purchase price, listed price shall also mean lease rate if applicable. Licensees shall refer to any broker acting as agent for a party. Okay? Limited agent means a licensee who, with written and informed consent of all parties to a real estate transaction, represents both seller and buyer. Limited agency authorization. The licensee is authorized by buyer and seller to represent both of them in this transaction. Seller and buyer understand that this limited agency relationship may create certain conflicts of interest and that licensee is representing two parties whose interests are different or even adverse. Yes, it's very difficult to do this. I don't recommend it. If it comes up, it comes up, but I don't pass up paychecks over it, but it's no fun. You feel dirty because of this exact what they're describing, conflicts of interest, and you're trying to represent two parties' best interest, and they happen to conflict, which is a problem. Buyer and seller acknowledge that the licensee shall not disclose the following without the informed consent in writing of both seller and buyer. Any material, confidential information, except for the stuff about the house that, you have to disclose by law. A buyer will pay more than offered, that a seller will accept less than listed price, what motivates either party, and other terms that would create a contractual advantage for one party over another. This number 5 is very sticky. Number 1's pretty sticky. Number 5 is very sticky. Most of the humans in the world are no good at negotiations. So they wouldn't even know if there was a contractual advantage being created on accident. You kind of think something you might say. I don't know. I'm trying to come up with an example. If all I said was, man, they're so excited, they love your house. Okay, if I tell that to my listing agent, because my buyers are super excited, they love the house, and they are, they just cannot wait to jump in that pool this summer. Seems chill, right? Your listing side's going, oh, how'd they like it? You're like, oh my gosh, they absolutely love it. They just cannot wait to jump in that pool this summer. You might have just created a contractual advantage for the seller. The seller now knows the excitement level of the buyer, which means they can play harder ball than the buyer can, because the buyer now, we just told them that the buyer wants it really bad. We should have been creating I can't really talk about that, but I do know they liked it enough to make an offer, right? That sort of thing. You can't give a contractual advantage. Showing one party is really, really, really excited is a contractual advantage for the other party. So that's where this gets really sticky. You have to be super careful. Seller and buyer acknowledge there will be no imputation of knowledge or information between any party and that limited agent among the licensee. We're not going to give any knowledge. Seller and buyer acknowledge they do not have to consent to the limited agency, so they can decline this form. Seller and buyer consent voluntarily, license limited agency capacity, and waive claims, damages, losses, expenses, including attorney's fees. Okay, but if we break rules in this, they could probably come after us, but we're trying to cover our butts here. Prior agreements, seller and buyer understand that this agreement does not replace prior agreements with licensee to represent seller or buyer. However, with this limited agency contradicts or conflicts with prior agreements, this limited agency shall supersede. So it doesn't replace the listing contract or the buyer's agency agreement or anything like that, but it does supersede them in the event they do conflict. So if the buyer or seller does not want limited agency, then they just need to not sell it to that buyer or that seller. That's just the answer, because the buyer has to pay us because they're under a contract. The listing side has to pay me because they're under a contract. So if y'all don't want to let me represent both of you, then you're going to have to not sell to one another, or I'm going to get paid anyway, okay? But this does not arise. I've never had somebody decline this. I had one person, I talked to him about it. I said, there's no real advantage to you. Do you want me to bring a buyer? They said no, so I just didn't bring a buyer. Cancellation if the buyer and seller do not agree into enter into an agreement relating to the property. If this transaction fails to close, seller and buyer agree, this agreement is automatically canceled and licensee's role of limited agent is terminated. So if they do not enter into an agreement related to the property, then it dies, which I don't know why that matters, but it does. And then the signatures, okay? That's that document, okay? It has to be completed the minute. You really should not be showing your own listing without this signed, okay? That's the rule. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but you really shouldn't, because the conflict of interest begin the moment that house comes on the radar. And I think you should get it filled out right away. And so does the law. Anyway, that's the limited agency agreement. And if you have any questions, let me know.